chapter 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Again, Jesus predicts his suffering and death. He's been telling his disciples this, trying to prepare them for this. And when he says even the number of days that are happening here, this is a way I think Matthew, in his presentation of Jesus, certainly lifts up the aspect of Jesus being a prophet. But in this might be more him as a king. Jesus like King David, right? Or a king who, in his majesty, his kingship, he knows all. He's not only predicting the future, what will happen to him, but it's Jesus' acceptance or willingness, his faithfulness. Like a king, Jesus is in control of what's happening in the last couple of days of his life here. Now, look, we could spend a couple of classes, almost a class on every paragraph in chapter 26. There's so much action, so much of the action that we think of as really the heart of the gospel, because it's the crucifixion we're talking about. It's the weekend of Easter, or however you want to look at that. Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Saturday and Sunday, Easter Sunday, the very first one. So there's so much here, but in order to get through it all, I won't give a sermon on. You've probably heard many sermons on each one of these things. I'll try to be to the point more than I normally am, or at least hit some highlights that may not be often accented in the ways that we understand these stories. But 26, we've got a lot before us here in this chapter. Chapter 26 of Matthew begins the Passion story. And when you hear that word passion in our day and time, it's a reminder to say, look, we're talking about the suffering. He suffers for those whom he loves. That's his passion. So we're in the Passion sequence, chapters 26, 27, and 28 that round out Matthew's gospel. If you want to locate it on the calendar, chapter 26 happens on Wednesday of Holy Week, and then towards the end of it, Thursday and Thursday night. You'll recognize it as we go through. It begins, chapter 26, verse 1, with this phrase that's happened 5 times in Matthew's gospel now, when Jesus had finished saying all these things. It closes those 5 long speeches. One was the Sermon on the Mount, and then we just finished the sequence where Jesus at the temple or outside of the temple is kind of his concluding sermon before this Passion sequence, where he is getting a bit apocalyptic, right? And a little hot under the collar, it seems. But here it is. It lets us know that we're moving from sermon into his suffering. He's finished saying all these things. That phrase also is an echo of Moses' final speech before his death in Deuteronomy. It says, Moses finished speaking all these words to Israel. And so it's sort of like a conclusion statement, but it helps us, again, Matthew, to tie Jesus back to Moses. Remember that strong connection. The first hearers in Matthew's church, being mostly Jewish, would have heard the scriptural echo. They would have gotten the, what's one of my favorite phrases? Intertextuality. Okay, they would have connected those dots. While Moses gives a final blessing to the people before his death, Jesus, being greater than Moses, does not merely die. He accomplishes ultimate deliverance, our victory over death for all who believe. Now, I want to take a moment as we're beginning chapter 26 to highlight a couple of the key connections. I made these points early on in the first couple of lessons, so think back in your very acute memories to September. Yeah, well, I'll just help you. How about I just remind you what those key connections are? All right. Matthew has this unique perspective on Jesus. All 4 Gospels, all 4 Gospel writers give a certain accent or emphasis to something about Jesus. Matthew's is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets of the Old Testament. And when I say prophet, think less about prediction, more of a corrective, like a doctor offers a prescription where the law goes sideways or falls short. The prophets correct it by reminding us of social justice, compassion, and mercy, which are laws of God, indeed, closer to the heart of God and the heart of all the law. So isn't that our Savior's heart? Compassion and justice and mercy. All right, so Matthew demonstrates Jesus as the new Moses, fulfilling the Torah and focusing Jesus' teachings on a higher righteousness. That is, yes, follow the commands of God, but even more, have a heart. Not just doing things, but have your heart in the right place to extend love and mercy and forgiveness to others, especially outsiders. So notice this as we go through the last sequence of Jesus' events on earth, how he does just this, particularly lifting up forgiveness, which may or may not have been such a key theme in the Old Testament. It certainly is for Jesus. Now remember, I think this is really important for us today because Matthew explores this deep human question throughout the gospel, but it comes to focus here in Jesus. It's a human question, I think, for all of us. What does it mean to be righteous? Or another way of saying it is, what does it mean to be a good person, to live a good life, to be the very best human that you can be? Well, it's more than merely being right by following the rules. It's also about having a heart that shows mercy, that can choose forgiveness, particularly when it seems like the other person doesn't deserve it. This is, in fact, the goal that God has in mind for all disciples. And we see it from the beginning of Matthew's gospel, the way that Joseph treated Mary when she was suddenly pregnant, the way that Jesus treats people who are outsiders, and so on and so forth. See how he is in his suffering and on the cross, and we'll see what it means to be righteous. Now, let's get into it. All I read was the first two verses if you just came in. We're on chapter 26, verse 3. Now, the chief priests and elders of the people gathered in the courtyard of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. Listen, here's another ominous gathering of religious leaders. It seems like we never hear about them gathering to do something good, but this again is conspiring together. It's a particular politics among chief priests and the elders there. They fear the majority of the people. They worry about a riot or a populace revolting into a revolution. They have control already in their culture, in their society. They are the dominant ones, but they seek to always make sure to secure their self-preservation and maintain their dominance. This is human nature, right? It's the type of human nature that Jesus resists. This temptation, the devil gave him this temptation, even here at the end. Jesus instead demonstrates his passion or his willingness to suffer, that he will offer himself as the opposite of the worst of human nature. Jesus chooses self-sacrifice and surrender to God's will. Let's keep rolling. 26, verse 6. While Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly perfume ointment. She poured it out on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum of money and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Wow. Beautiful scene. No doubt you've heard a lot about this story, the woman with the alabaster jar. The beauty of this scene and her act of loving kindness, her act of perhaps we might think contrition about her situation in life. We're not sure of that, but there's been a lot made of that. We think about her action and her compassion, that her heart may have been broken over her own sin, but simultaneously, she is a person overflowing with grace, with generosity, with love for her Savior. She is the portrait then of every believer. We don't know her identity in Matthew, so that's not important. Other Gospels might point this out. I I think it's in John's Gospel we learn that she was probably Mary, the sister of Martha, the Mary and Martha stories. That Mary, there's a lot of Marys, so if you're keeping track, you might want to make a scorecard because it's hard to follow the connections there if you just use the name Mary. So it could be her. We don't know. Matthew doesn't tell us, so I'll go back to just her actions speak for her. She is a model, an example, an inspiration for believers to worship Jesus in such a way. How does she worship? Well, she'll do this in public, or at least at a public dinner, where other people are going to see, but she's intent on repenting, showing remorse, and making a sacrificial offering. She loves Jesus in this way. She anoints him. Again, Matthew lifting up the identity of Jesus as King of Israel here. Kings are anointed, right? On Jesus' head or on his hair while he's eating. And with a generous amount of something that's not cheap, this costly anointing oil or ointment or perfume, however you want to interpret that. She may in fact be understanding that Jesus is about to sacrifice himself. Probably not. Jesus is the one who says, well, this is for my burial. So he is again, like the king, very much in control and saying, this is how it shall be. It will go this way and I will do this. But we also are understanding Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples. And she is preparing him, and he is preparing the disciples. And they are not learning. They are not in a learner's mindset. They are in a judging mindset. And it is, in this gospel, presented as they, like multiple disciples. In other gospels, it's Judas, particularly, who says, why this waste? We could have sold that ointment to give more money to the poor. This objection, by the way, whether it's Judas or others in the disciple group, I don't know that they're truly thinking about the poor, right? It tends to be, and if it is Judas, when you have responsibility for money, you tend to think more and more conservatively. Or Judas, we understand, was the treasurer of the group. And sometimes, what's the old saying? The heavier the purse, the tighter the strings, that kind of thing, where you just get into this mindset where, or Judas, it could be more his personality. Control issues. You think of it that way. Just wanted to be very controlling. One other word about Judas, because he's going to factor in here Wednesday of Holy Week as he goes from this scene, Thursday, Last Supper scene, and then we really don't see him again. Judas, one theory has been that Judas had in mind a way of forcing Jesus' hand. So thinking about this scene, thinking about perhaps controlling, somebody who wants to be very controlling. Judas was of a political persuasion where he thought Jesus should be taking more control of Israel, raising up perhaps a revolt, army that would go against the Roman occupying government. And so if he can see, Judas believes in Jesus and can see Jesus having this power, but he wants Jesus to use the power the way Judas wants the power to be used in order to bring about that Old Testament messianic expectation of bringing the nation of Israel back to superpower status. And that would be a way of honoring God. That must be God's will, he's thinking. So he kind of takes matters in his own hands in some ways to kind of kickstart Jesus into more of a revolutionary political figure. Interestingly, all that could be happening in the background of this story. We don't know. But Jesus really doesn't react too much to what the disciples were saying about this waste. He honors what the woman chooses to do. No gift given to Jesus is wasted. It is worship. And so he honors her and says so much to say, centuries from now, people telling the story will honor her. And so we do. We do lift up her act of worship, generosity, sacrifice, and loving worship. All right. Verse 14. One of the 12, who was called Judas, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me?" So again, I was putting into that previous story more on Judas, and we get that in the other Gospels, but right here, as the very next scene, we see something like Judas is reacting. He's probably still angry from this scene with the woman so-called being wasteful with resources. Now, Judas goes to the chief priest, verse 15. What will you give me? So now understand, in human nature, this is such a very common question. But when we maybe are not self-aware enough, if we find ourselves asking, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? What can I get out of this? Then we might be reminded of Judas, might be reminded that it may not be the best angels of our human nature, right? If we only go in that direction. So Judas is looking, what's in it for me? They paid him 30 pieces of silver. Not to worry about the exact sum of what that money, it's not a whole lot. But verse 16, from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. Again, this is Wednesday in Holy Week, and I'm reminding, some of you have heard this before, reminding you the connection points back to Joseph of the Old Testament, who was betrayed by his brother Judah for a few pieces of silver, sold into slavery, right? So Jesus is betrayed by Judas for a few pieces of silver. And I think the two stories have so many connection points, the story of Jesus, the story of Joseph of the Old Testament, because the climax, one of the ultimate lessons is about forgiveness, is about the fact God has a plan. Sometimes it's really hard to see that plan, but overarching all of these next, tragic events that are going to happen to Jesus, God is in control, God has a plan, and God is going to work it out for the very best, even though this seems like one of the worst of times. So God consistently works good out of bad situations. That's one of the take-homes. I think one of the reasons why God, Holy Spirit, Scripture writers in the Bible have such a connection between that ending story of the book of Genesis, right at the beginning of the Bible, the story of God's people, and this sort of central, very important story of Jesus fulfilling all of this. All right, verse 17, on the first day of unleavened bread, so the Passover week, right? The disciples came to Jesus saying, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? He said, go into the city, a certain man, and say, the teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Verse 19, so the disciples did as Jesus directed them. They prepared the Passover meal. And when it was even, he took his place with the 12 disciples. And while they were eating, verse 21, Jesus said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him, one after the other, surely not I, Lord. He answered, the one who's dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. Judas, who betrayed him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. He replied, you have said so. I mean, kind of an ominous scene. I mean, just filled with dramatic action and some wordplay here. You can probably help yourself in thinking of this scene again by just imagining the questioning, the suspense, and the really, I would think, almost depressive mood among the disciples when they hear this. At such an intimate moment, such a high spiritual moment, celebrating the Passover, and Jesus has been saying that he's going to die, but none of us here could be at fault. No way. We've been so close and with him for so long now. They must have just been heartsick about this. Now, Jesus has these moments, I think, where he heightens the suspense. Possibly it's about bringing about personal conviction in the heart of the person or the persons who are about to let him down. But he does this with Judas, or certainly we'll soon see a similar thing with Peter, Peter's denial. But each of the disciples questions aloud. If you think about 11 of them going around kind of in a circle, not me, Lord. And all of the 11 say the word Lord out of respect and a faith claim of deep-hearted belief, except for Judas, who's probably the last one to speak up, had just had his hand in the bowl with, so Jesus was pointing that out. He dipped his hand at the same time. And then Judas kind of tipping his hand, you almost wonder about his tone of voice, if he said it almost maybe a little facetiously, if the others picked up on it. But if not, it was surely the case that he says, Rabbi, Judas, the only one of the 12 who calls him teacher instead of Lord. So almost a little less respect from Judas, but another way for the other 11 to get their question answered. Another way to kind of think about the severity of this is if you've ever had a child lie to your face. Here is Judas saying this directly to Jesus, not me, when he knows he's got the money in his pocket already. Anyhow, you understand the significance of this. At such a moment when Jesus is about to give to his disciples, but to all of us, something as precious as Holy Communion. It's interesting. The wonderful high moments of life are always intermixed with some of the low points. Well, let's listen on about this communion scene. Verse 26 in Matthew chapter 26. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." He took the cup. After giving thanks, he gave to them and said, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Well, there's a lot here, and as I mentioned, looking at the clock, I will try not to go too deep into any one place, but just allow that paragraph to sing its beautiful song to us. It is what we celebrate as Holy Communion today. Back then, it was literally the Jewish Seder meal for Passover that Jesus was celebrating, but he brings this new liturgy, this new language, this new understanding, this reality into focus, that Jesus becomes the bread and the cup, his body, his blood. Now, it's a beautiful moment for those who experienced it at first. They were with him for so long, about 3 years, day and night, traveling around, learning so much about Jesus, growing so close as a group and with him. So it's a touching moment. And on a spiritual note, you would understand, intertextuality here, it's like the story of Exodus, right? That Jesus becomes the manna, the bread from heaven himself, in order to sustain God's people, to be the one who will provide where they need such spiritual provision. His body, his blood, his self-sacrifice, offering himself to fulfill the law in Exodus and Leviticus, and to lift up, perhaps in the most focused way ever in the Scriptures, the important, compassionate action of forgiveness. So he really puts forgiveness into this central act of our faith now. And that's really important. It's interesting. I'll make a couple little notes then. In the language that we get in English, it often says the word "it." Like Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it. Well, there's a number of reasons to lift this up. The blessing is, and the understanding, particularly from the Old Testament point of view, our Jewish friends, you bless God, or you give God thanks. God has already blessed creation, the bread, the cup. All these things are a blessing because they all come from God. But in our English language, when we sit down to grace at the table, we ask God to bless the food. But the real understanding here, the scriptural understanding, you go back to the Psalms and things like that, is blessing God's name, offering prayer, offering a heart of gratitude. I was taught by someone smarter than me. We sat down at a table. She was a visiting evangelist or teaching pastor, and she was coming to our district, our church, and we had picked her up from Dulles Airport, and we sat down to buy her lunch, and she said, "Oh, I'll do the blessing. Just lift your plate up. Grateful." And that's all we said for the blessing. We're just giving God thanks. That's what it is. You don't have to, be worried about, is something wrong with the food that it needs a special blessing? Well, it's about giving thanks to God is what Jesus is doing in this moment. Nothing wrong with the bread. It's just that he is thanking God for the provision and then demonstrating that he himself is now the bread of life given for all. I love this where it says all. Okay, I am getting a little far down in the weeds here. Pastors make so much out of so little, right? It's the little words like it or all. Going back to the word it, by the way. The word it just doesn't show up in the biblical languages, right? We're inserting that there to try to help our modern English thinkers think that way. But also, I think our modern English, we go with the word all over the place, and we forget the significance of it. What just happened in this story? What just happened were really a couple of different negative interactions, particularly with Judas. Jesus, being the Savior of all, is offering himself to all, including Judas. Yeah, I know Jesus had just said this thing where it's really a strong judgment, woe to him. It would have been better if he hadn't been born. Well, yeah, because he's got one of the worst roles, to be immortalized in the gospel stories as the villain, right, of the group, the betrayer, the Benedict Arnold, if you will, right? So it doesn't mean that Judas goes to hell. It doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't love him. Jesus offers him the bread of forgiveness, right? Well, let's see. Let's go on. I just want to leave that hanging right there. I love this, verse 30. I'm going to talk about just one verse at a time here for this situation. Chapter 26, verse 30. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Isn't that wonderful to include the hymn in the gospel story? I mean, they didn't include the hymn itself, but to make mention of that small fact. The faith has always been a melodic faith, right? We've always been a singing people, all the way back through the first hymn book, which was the Psalms, all the way back to the beginning of time. A lot of the Old Testament was written lyrically in the Hebrew language to understand it, to remember it better. And, it was an oral tradition before it was ever written down. So we've always been a singing people, and it was great to see that that was part of their special ritual, just like what we still do. I mean, some of you sing, right? I mean, I see in my church, it's probably 1 out of 3. Some of us still sing the faith, or at least we enjoy the music. But Jesus was singing. Ever thought about the Savior as a singer? Well, it's just something to think about. So, verse 31.
What was the hymn?
Yeah, great question. What was the hymn? So we could ask one of our Jewish brothers or sisters what was commonly sung perhaps at the end of the Seder meal. But they would have done those. Yeah. Jewish hymns in Hebrew. Yeah. Jesus. Now, of course, they would speak some Aramaic and Greek, but they would have sung in Hebrew. So we know that much. I'll tell you that. So it was a Hebrew hymn. I don't know which one. Probably hymn number 100. Isn't that a great one? I'm teasing. But thank you for the question. This is a good question. You didn't deserve my answer, but it was a bad answer, is what I mean. Verse 31. You will all fall away. I mean, there it is. This is Jesus saying to all of them real quick. Jesus says, you will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Okay, this is prophecy quoted and fulfilled. So happens in Matthew all the time. This is Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7, if you're keeping score at home. More prophecies are quoted and fulfilled in Matthew than in all of the Gospels. So again, it's part of the point in this first of our 4 Gospels is that Matthew is building such an evidentiary case for what God planned and promised it long ago has come to full fulfillment in Jesus now. So God has had this overarching plan, and it's all coming together. Don't miss this. But I think about the heaviness of the moment too. Again, wonderful, beautiful scenes of Jesus with his small group of friends, and it's juxtaposed with these, shocking, tragic learnings that now they're being told, all of us are going to fail you, Jesus. We were just now getting used to looking at Judas as a bad guy. We'd never thought of him that way before. But now all of us are, how can that be? And he's talking about a prophecy being fulfilled. So this is part of God's plan. So in a sense, take a deep breath. Verse 32, after I am raised up. So again, this prediction, this prophecy, do they catch that? Do they really believe it's going to be resurrection? I'm sure they're still reeling from these other shocking things he said. So they can't quite grasp it. Verse 32, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Peter said, even if all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said, truly I tell you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said, Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. And you see the leadership of Peter here. He's got a heartfelt pledge. He pledges his loyalty to the death, all of this. But, his promises are promises he feels and he means, but he can't keep. I don't know how Peter might have received what Jesus said about 3 times denying him this very night. Peter certainly was shocked, but that was a lot to grasp. He must have been confused at the very least. But what went right past all of them, Peter goes back to this thing about, we're not going to let you down. But Jesus has said, after I'm raised up, I would have been, if I were Peter or somebody else, wanting to ask questions about that. What do you mean? Tell us how this can be. How will it happen? But the amazing part of the resurrection is surprisingly left alone. Now we go to another tender scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, the prayer scene. Chapter 26, verse 36. Now, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took in Peter, the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. And he said, "My soul is deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." And then he came to his disciples and found them sleeping. He said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Oh, how many times have we heard that quote, right? Verse 42. Again, he went out for a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." After he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went and prayed for a third time, saying the same words. And then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Now the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Look, my betrayer is at hand." In this scene in the garden, we find in sharp focus Jesus' full humanity. He is praying to God, just like you and I would need to pray to God. And yet he is the Son of God, but he is in need of prayer, puts this priority into his prayer life. He is trusting God, calling upon God, at the same time exhibiting real suffering. The real humanity of Jesus, we are seeing it in his suffering. Remember, Gethsemane, the word means press, like a olive press, right? Oil press, where something is crushed in order to transform it for another purpose. Jesus was in God's Gethsemane press, pressed down, hard pressed for sure, to fulfill God's purpose in his life. So even Jesus struggles to do what God is ultimately asking him to do. Can you see that here? In doing so, Jesus experiences the fullness of human feeling, the emotions from grief and agitation. Perhaps could there even be a moment of doubt? I mean, some people would be angry that I just suggested. But look at verse 39. "If it's possible, let this cup pass from me." If Jesus basically is saying, if it could be, I wouldn't want to go through this kind of pressing, suffering, what he knows will be excruciating pain on the cross. By the way, even the word excruciating has the word crucify in its center, its root word. But isn't that human for Jesus or anyone to wonder, can I make it through this? Do I? Must I? Will I? Well, Jesus shows us the example of true human free will to willingly choose God's will. And he says these words not once but 3 times. "Not my will, but yours be done." So he models for the disciples, for us, for all time, the very prayer that he teaches us, the Lord's Prayer, praying God's will over his own will. So if you can accept that full humanity of Christ, I think you can see the depth of that wonderful story. On the other side of that coin are the other disciples, the three that he brought with him. Think about them. Have you ever imagined, could you think of a disciple napping on Jesus? I mean, and this is like in the climactic moments of the whole gospel story. Well, have any of us fallen asleep? I mean, it's a very human scene. Yes, these disciples. By the way, Jesus had just fed them a good meal, including wine, right? So, I mean, can you blame them for taking, and they're out there in the nice cool of the evening in the dark garden. Oh, I could totally understand. But Jesus had told them what to do. In fact, they had no other job than to stay awake. Just stay awake for me for an hour. And, well, they doze off. That is so disciple-like. That is so human. And by the way, who were the three? Peter and the other two. These are the three that Jesus chose to take up the mountain for his transfiguration. What a contrast between those two experiences. Jesus on the mountaintop, his face shining with glory, high, lifted up, and you have the other great prophets stand with him, Moses and Elijah, and Jesus is exalted. And of course, the disciples are there, dumbfounded. They don't fall asleep then, but they obviously don't know what to do either. But these disciples who so wanted to be with Jesus, were so excited on the mountaintop transfiguration experience, now are falling asleep when Jesus needed them most. I'll also point out the three times. The repetition and the use of the number 3, it happens a lot in the Passion sequence. You don't have to read a whole lot into it, but understand it's about fulfillment. Fulfillment. Jesus was totally suffering in his time of prayer in the garden, yet prays 3 times, choosing God's will, a way of saying, I will fulfill, even though I don't want to. I mean, no human being wants to suffer, but he will suffer for God. 3 times Jesus got up from prayer to check on his disciples. 3 times, coming soon, Peter will deny Jesus. The rooster will crow 3 times. So there's all these 3s, right? Most importantly, it's pointing to, not only showing fulfillment in that moment, but pointing to the 3rd day. On the 3rd day is when God raised Jesus. So there's that foreshadowing as well. So all of that's in there intentionally. Verse 47, while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him. At once he came up to Jesus and said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you are here to do. Note that Jesus called him friend. They came and laid hands on him, and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And Jesus said, Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen this way? At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a rebel? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, you did not arrest me. But all this had taken place so that the Scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Prophecy and fulfillment. Promises kept. Jesus points it out in his own words more than once here, and what he had just said a few hours ago about all of them failing him, well, they all act upon it, and the disciples desert him and flee. But let's look at the betrayal here in the garden. Judas does what he aimed to do. Well, I'm going to leave you more with questions about Judas than any pertinent answer, perhaps. Something to think about, maybe ruminate on in your prayer life if you haven't already. Does Judas perhaps serve a greater good in this way? I mean, he had a role to play. Certainly the lesser angels of his human nature were what he was acting on. Perhaps it was a little bit of greed, a little bit of controlling, pride, however you want to put it. Maybe he really had built up some resentment against Jesus. I don't know his deep motives. Only God knows. But we need a Judas in the story, do we not? How else does Jesus get to the cross? If it were not for his betrayal, this greater good, how would salvation come to the world through the cross? It's a mystery. I can't answer that for you. But I want you to know that it has been a rich debate through Christian history. Is Judas in heaven? Only God knows. I would certainly hold out hope for a forgiving God, even of Judas, and Jesus as the witness to that for the different things he said. Certainly Jesus had some anger up against him too, and that's only human, so we can understand all of that. But I would just lift up that there have been voices in Christian history that have quickly condemned Judas and sent him straight to hell. I think, by the way, that's no human person's business, right? So we should be first and foremost focused on our own salvation and not condemning someone else to eternity for punishment. That's up to God. But on the other hand, just think about those different things that may have motivated Judas. But at the end of the statement about Judas, you got to think of this. Where have I been a betrayer of my Lord? Right? So the character of Judas should at least serve to motivate us to a little more self-examination. It's not like I'm better than somebody else, right? Let's just think clearly. Okay. One of the other 11 disciples had a sword. Does that shock anybody? Well, no. I mean, it was for protection. They were an itinerant group who needed to protect themselves on the traveling road all the time. Bandits, wild animals. Yeah, one or two of them might have a sword. And it's only human reaction to want to protect their master. But understandably, don't miss the point, Jesus stops the violence. Very intentional to bring out this point. You know, sorry about the man's ear, but it's really, I think, a moment to share with not only the crowd then, and Jesus' human free will choice then, but for all time for us to say, oh, look, clearly Jesus was a nonviolent leader. And he reminds people of his own choice. You know, there was a possibility Jesus could have called from heaven a force to fight with him, for him, to rescue him. But that's not what God's will was. God, in fact, had a plan for Jesus to die a nonviolent death after a nonviolent ministry, but it is a violent death. You know, the violence is on the part of his betrayer, his torturers, the people who condemn him, his executioners. So Jesus dies a violent death, but in a non-violent way. Very intentional, and it's a way that hopefully continues to speak to Christianity about the Prince of Peace and Jesus' followers being less violent. Would that be the case? Verse 57, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered, and Peter was following at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priests, the whole council, were looking for false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last two came forward and said, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. Blasphemy. How is it that all of a sudden this is blasphemy? Well, Jesus is quoting Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, Psalm 110, and he's quoting Daniel chapter 7, kind of wrapping those two together in a very powerful statement. And they hear that as Jesus openly saying he's the Son of God, or equal with God, or he is the Messiah. Now, prior to that, they have false accusations. They have a rushed trial done stealthily at night. But this is how they're operating. Remember, it seems like every time these political, religious authorities get together, it's conspiring and it's for something really harsh. But this is how they treat Jesus. The high priest tore his clothes, verse 65. He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, he deserves death. 67. They spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him and saying, prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you? Now they begin to abuse Jesus. His torture is physical, but I think also of the emotional toil that it took. The total disrespect for Jesus. For he truly is a prophet. He truly is God's Son, and yet they are mocking him and taunting him and speaking sarcastically to him. So there's a lot of his suffering, more than simply the physical that we think of on the cross. One last scene, my friends. I think we have time for this. Yes. Peter's denial. Now Peter is sitting outside in the courtyard, verse 69. A female servant came to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before all of them, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. And he went out to the porch. Another female servant saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus the Nazarene. Again he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you. And then he began to curse and swore an oath. I do not know the man. At that moment, the cock crowed. And then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. This is the failure we all face. That there are some moments in life where we just fall short of what we know God expects of us, or what we think. You know, we've already said, Peter already said, he'd already made that sort of like heartfelt promise to Jesus. I proclaim my loyalty even to the death, you know. And we can understand, being so close to Jesus, so in love with him, so, committed to following him. He changed his life already. Peter's life had been elevated by Jesus. So Peter, of course, is going to say those things and feel them to his core. But isn't it human for us to end up at some point not able to fully live out our convictions, to be true to our beliefs, to completely do the right thing? Anybody out there ever made a mistake? Yes, of course. But in these moments, it's about that conviction, about being able to realize, that is part of me. I've got to own that. Peter had that moment of comeuppance. How did it happen? Well, as the scriptures say about themselves here, it's an accent. Peter spoke in a certain way. The Hebrew word is shibboleth. And not to get too much into it, let's just think, all right, where are they? They're in Jerusalem. Where's Peter from? The Galilee region, which is farther north, right? And this is a crude, and forgive me because I'm not going to do it justice here, but there are people, maybe some of you who are listening to me, who are from parts farther north than I am. All right, I was born in Virginia. I tried to do well, not to speak too often with a southern drawl, but yeah, it's part of me. You may pick up on it, particularly if you're from the north. Now, I'm not going to be able to do a northern accent very well, but I'm going to try. But if you're from the north, you might ask somebody around the campfire, can I have some more coffee? Right? Do you understand what I mean? Coffee. So I drink coffee, but in the north, they don't. They drink coffee. And so Peter keeps saying, where's the coffee? Actually, he would say it never mind about the Hebrew. But the point is, he keeps saying these things. And the more he talks, the more it's evident that he's not from around these parts, right? And there they are in the south going, we can tell you're not from around here. So please, you got to be honest. You were with Jesus. You came down here from Galilee, all of you as a group. Yeah. It's obvious that Peter can't deny Jesus. Jesus has become so much a part of who he is that his reaction is actually an affirmation that he's with Jesus, that he hears the rooster crowing and he is cut to the heart. And this is the thing about Jesus, that Jesus has gotten inside of Peter, and I would hope all the other disciples, with the exception of Judas, probably at this point, that they have internalized his moral teaching, his loving heart, his compassionate practices. It's habits to see other people and to feel their pain, be empathetic, to be showing love, compassion, and mercy. That Peter, he just has all that good welling up with him, and it strikes him so hard, it hurts him so much that he has failed, because he knows how much he's learned and how much he had a chance to, well, do the right thing. And 3 times he tried to take the quick and easy way out, just saying, no. It just wasn't the right time for him. He was trying to process everything that was happening to Jesus and what's going to be tomorrow with us as disciples if Jesus is arrested. And what if they put him to death? Is it all over? And so Peter's got all this whirling around in his head. But in his heart, I see his heartbreak here as a good sign of all the love, forgiveness, and compassion that Jesus has already shown to him. Now, we get ahead of the story a little bit for me to talk about forgiveness. This is the point of conviction where Peter knows he has failed and he's got to repent. So the good news is, what we find in the last scenes of Jesus is this highlighting of forgiveness. Of course, to be forgiven, you got to know there's something wrong. Something went wrong. So we also see that part, the highlighting of the things that have gone wrong, the way all the disciples have failed. And what we should take out of it is, oh, I need to spend some prayerful time thinking on my sins, acknowledging my own failing, my own proclivity to not live up to the promises that I make to God, or maybe other people in my life. Might be more the context for you and I today. How have I not been that person who fully affirms my loving connection with the people that God has placed in my life and treat them the way that Jesus, always see them, see what they're going through, have compassion, want to reach out a helping hand. So all of that in the last 2 days before going to the cross. We went today in chapter 26 from Wednesday to Thursday night, late at night, the overnight trial. And when we join together again, God willing, next Tuesday, we'll be talking about Good Friday, the cross. Questions, comments? Something I missed? Yeah, hold on.